In her comfortable suburban home, a 73-year-old grandmother was about to uncover a devastating betrayal. What started as an ordinary afternoon babysitting her beloved grandchildren took a shocking turn when she came face to face with her family's calculated deception. Margaret Holloway wasn't your typical vulnerable senior. For 43 years, she had spent her life building a home and raising a family in the house she and her late husband, Harold, had purchased as newlyweds, known for her sharp mind and generous heart. When she overheard her grandchildren innocently playing moving day with their toys, explaining that Mommy told them after Grandma goes away, we get her big house and all her things, she had no idea she was walking into a web of manipulation that had been spinning around her for months. Margaret's growing awareness of her children's true priorities would lead to a complete transformation of everything she thought she knew about family loyalty. What began as a grandmother's quiet afternoon of childcare would become a journey of radical self-discovery and independence. Her family would never be the same after Margaret chose to reclaim her life entirely on her own terms. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Part 1. The Innocent Revelation. Margaret's hands moved. With the practiced rhythm of 47 years in the same kitchen, seasoning the chicken breasts that would become dinner for 3 generations of Sullivans, the familiar weight of her grandmother's cast-iron skillet felt reassuring in her grip. A tangible connection to the countless meals she'd prepared in this very spot, from Sandra's first solid foods to the elaborate Sunday dinners that had once brought the whole family together. The October afternoon light filtered through the gauze curtains she'd sewn herself in 1987, casting warm shadows across the honey oak countertops that Gerald had installed the year before Robert was born. Every surface in this kitchen held a memory. Every drawer contained tools that had served multiple purposes across decades of family life. The ceramic mixing bowls stacked in the corner had witnessed birthday cake batter and cookie dough, while the wooden spoon hanging by the stove had stirred everything from infant formula to Thanksgiving gravy. From the living room came the delighted squeals of Emma and Lucas, her beloved grandchildren, their voices carrying the pure joy that only children could summon from the simplest activities. Margaret smiled as she adjusted the heat under the potatoes, grateful for Sandra's request to babysit while she ran errands. These precious hours with Emma and Lucas had become the highlight of Margaret's week since Gerald's passing 8 months ago. "Grandma!" Lucas's voice rang out, followed by the thunder of small feet racing toward the kitchen. At 6, he still possessed that boundless energy that could exhaust adults twice his size. "Emma says we need boxes. Big ones." Margaret turned from the stove, wiping her hands on the apron that had been a Mother's Day gift from Sandra 3 years ago. The fabric was beginning to fade, but the sentiment remained dear. "Boxes, sweetheart. What kind of boxes?" "For moving day," Lucas announced with the dramatic flair that made him such a joy to watch. His dark hair, so much like his grandfather's had been, stuck up at odd angles, and his t-shirt bore evidence of their afternoon adventures. "Emma's the boss, and she says we need to pack everything up." 8-year-old Emma appeared in the doorway with the air of authority she'd inherited from her mother's side of the family. Even at her young age, she possessed Sandra's organizational skills and decisive nature. "We're playing moving day, Grandma, like when people have to pack up their whole house and go somewhere new." Margaret's chest tightened with a familiar pang. Moving day games felt too close to reality these days, with neighbors her age gradually disappearing into retirement communities or assisted living facilities. Mrs. Patterson next door had moved to Sunset Manor just last month, leaving behind the rose garden she'd tended for 30 years. "That sounds like quite an undertaking," Margaret said, forcing lightness into her voice. "Are you moving somewhere exciting?" Lucas bounced on his toes, his excitement infectious. "Emma says we're moving to Grandma's house, the big one with all the pretty things." Margaret's stirring slowed. confusion creeping into her smile. "But sweetheart, you're already at Grandma's house." Emma stepped forward with the patience of an older sister accustomed to clarifying things for adults. "No, Grandma. We're pretending. We're moving into your house after—" She paused, her brow furrowing as if trying to remember exact words. "After you go away. Mommy explained it to us." The wooden spoon slipped from Margaret's fingers, clattering against the stovetop. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden stillness that had fallen over the kitchen. "After I go away?" "Uh-huh." Lucas chimed in, oblivious to the change in atmosphere. "Mommy said when you go away we get to have your big house and all your pretty things. She showed us the dishes with the flowers and said they'd be ours." Margaret's hand gripped the counter's edge, her knuckles white against the oak surface Gerald had sanded and stained with such care. The room seemed to tilt slightly, as if the foundation of everything she'd believed about her family had shifted beneath her feet. Emma nodded seriously, her expression carrying the matter-of-fact acceptance children brought to adult explanations. "She said it's like when Grandpa Gerald went away, except this time we get to keep the house instead of just visiting it." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Each innocent syllable drove deeper into her consciousness, shattering assumptions she'd never even realized she'd been making. Her daughter, her own daughter, had discussed Margaret's death with her children as if it were a real estate transaction. Had explained inheritance as if Margaret were already gone, already nothing more than an obstacle between the children and their windfall. "We should pack the good china first," Emma continued, warming to her role as household manager. "The ones with the roses that Mommy always says are too fancy for regular use, and that big TV in the living room. Lucas wants that for his room." Margaret's breath came in shallow gasps. The kitchen that had always been her sanctuary suddenly felt foreign, as if she were seeing it through her daughter's eyes. Not as a beloved family space where memories lived in every drawer and cabinet, but as inventory to be cataloged and distributed. The children had returned to their game, racing back to the living room with renewed enthusiasm. Their voices carried clearly through the open doorway, Emma's authoritative tone directing Lucas to pack various items she'd apparently already mentally assigned to their future ownership. "Don't forget the jewelry box on Grandma's dresser," Emma called out. "Mommy said it has real pearls and a ring that's worth lots of money." Margaret sank onto the kitchen stool Gerald had built for her arthritic days, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. The familiar sounds of her home, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock above the sink, the distant laughter of her grandchildren, now seemed to mock her. Even the walls themselves felt complicit in a conspiracy she'd never imagined existed. How long had Sandra been planning this? How many conversations had taken place in Margaret's absence, reducing her life to assets and square footage? The children's casual knowledge of her possessions suggested this wasn't a recent discussion, but an ongoing narrative in their household. Margaret's eyes swept across the kitchen, seeing it now as Sandra apparently did. The antique mixer that had belonged to Gerald's mother. The set of Depression-era glasses inherited from her own grandmother. The hand-painted serving platters that had graced every holiday table for decades. All of it apparently already spoken, for already distributed in Sandra's mind among heirs who were eagerly awaiting Margaret's departure from the world. The timer for the potatoes began its insistent beeping, but Margaret made no move to respond. She sat frozen in her chair, processing the magnitude of what she'd discovered. Her daughter, the child she'd nursed through countless illnesses, supported through her divorce, helped with mortgage payments when money was tight, saw her not as a beloved mother, but as a temporary guardian of valuable assets. From the living room came the sound of the children's game reaching new heights of enthusiasm. Emma was explaining to Lucas how they'd redecorate their house, which rooms they'd claim, which furniture they'd replace. Their innocent joy in planning their grandmother's posthumous legacy felt like salt in a wound Margaret hadn't even known existed until moments ago. The kitchen door remained open, and Margaret could see Sandra's car pulling into the driveway through the living room window. Her daughter was returning from her errands, probably expecting to find her mother and children enjoying a peaceful evening together. She would walk through that door with her usual cheerful demeanor, thank Margaret for babysitting, and continue the charade of loving concern that now felt like another layer of betrayal. Margaret's hand trembled as she reached for the timer, finally silencing its urgent call. The potatoes would be overcooked now, but that seemed trivial compared to the fundamental shift in her understanding of her place within her own family. In the living room, Emma's voice carried a note of maternal instruction that sounded disturbingly familiar. "Remember, Lucas, we can't tell Grandma about our game. Mommy said it's a surprise for later." The surprise, Margaret realized with crystalline clarity, was that she was supposed to remain ignorant of her family's inheritance fantasies until the moment she could no longer interfere with them. Part 2. The Mask of Normalcy. Sandra's key turned in the front door with its familiar metallic click, the sound that had once meant comfort and family togetherness now striking Margaret's ears like a warning bell. She forced herself to stand from the kitchen stool, her legs unsteady beneath her as she moved toward the stove with practiced motions that felt suddenly foreign to her own hands. "Mom, I'm back!" Sandra's voice carried its usual cheerful energy as she entered, keys jangling in her purse. "How were my little angels?" Margaret's throat felt constricted, but she managed to call back. "Just fine, sweetheart. Dinner's almost ready." The endearment tasted bitter on her tongue now, weighted with new understanding of how conditional Sandra's affection might truly be. Emma and Lucas burst from the living room like released springs, racing to embrace their mother. Margaret watched from the kitchen doorway as Sandra gathered them close, her face lighting up with genuine maternal love that made the revelation even more confusing. How could someone capable of such warmth toward her children speak so callously about her own mother's future demise? "We played the best game ever, Mommy," Lucas announced, bouncing on his toes. "We played moving trucks," Emma interrupted smoothly, shooting her brother a meaningful look. "Just pretend trucks delivering furniture." Margaret caught the exchange, noting how quickly Emma had redirected Lucas from their original game. The 8-year-old's ability to manage the conversation showed a sophistication that chilled Margaret. How many other family secrets had the children been coached to keep? Sandra kissed each child's forehead before approaching Margaret, her designer handbag slung over her shoulder with practiced ease. Even in casual clothes, Sandra maintained an appearance that spoke of financial stability, or at least the illusion of it. Margaret had always admired her daughter's put-together look, never questioning where the money came from to maintain such standards on a single mother's income. "You're a lifesaver, Mom," Sandra said, reaching to embrace Margaret. The hug felt different now. Margaret noticed how Sandra's eyes swept over her shoulder, taking inventory of the kitchen's contents even during their supposed moment of affection. "I know it's getting harder for you to chase after these two." The casual assumption about Margaret's declining abilities stung. At 72, Margaret still walked 3 miles every morning, maintained her own garden, and could outpace most people half her age. But Sandra's comment revealed an underlying narrative Margaret was only now beginning to recognize. "No trouble at all," Margaret replied carefully, studying her daughter's face for signs of the calculating woman who had apparently been discussing inheritance plans with innocent children. "They were telling me about some of their games." Sandra's expression didn't change, but Margaret caught a slight tension around her eyes. "Oh, you know how creative kids can be. They come up with the most elaborate scenarios." "Indeed they do." Margaret turned back to the stove, using the motion to hide her face while she processed Sandra's casual dismissal. "How were your errands?" "Oh, the usual running around." Sandra settled onto the kitchen stool Margaret had just vacated, her movements claiming the space with unconscious entitlement. Had to stop by the bank, picked up some groceries, swung by that new real estate office on Maple Street. Margaret's hand stilled on the serving spoon. Real estate office? Just browsing, Sandra said with a laugh that sounded forced. You know how I love looking at houses I can't afford. That agent, Jennifer something, was showing me listings in the area. Amazing what property values have done around here lately. The words landed with calculated precision, and Margaret realized this wasn't casual conversation but reconnaissance. Sandra was researching the value of the very house they sat in, probably calculating her future windfall down to the last dollar. The market has certainly changed, Margaret agreed neutrally, her training as a retired teacher helping her maintain classroom composure even as her world crumbled around her. Sandra's gaze drifted around the kitchen, lingering on Margaret's china cabinet with its collection of inherited pieces. It really is incredible what some of these older homes are worth now. All that character, the built-in details you can't get in new construction. Her fingers traced the oak countertop appreciatively. Good bones in these old places. Margaret followed Sandra's visual tour of the room, seeing her own possessions through her daughter's appraising eyes. The china cabinet Gerald had built by hand, the restored 1940s Frigidaire that still worked perfectly, the copper pots hanging from hooks Gerald had installed for their 20th anniversary. All of it apparently already catalogued in Sandra's mental inventory. Of course, maintenance costs can be brutal, Sandra continued, her tone shifting to one of concerned practicality. That's what the realtor was saying. These older homes, they're money pits if you don't stay on top of things. New roof, updated electrical, plumbing issues. She looked directly at Margaret. Must be overwhelming to handle all that alone. The subtext was clear. Margaret was becoming too old and frail to maintain the family home properly. The house was too much responsibility for someone her age. Sandra was planting seeds of doubt about Margaret's competence, perhaps preparing ground for future arguments about why Margaret should give up her independence. I manage just fine, Margaret said quietly, but Sandra was already moving on to her next point. The kids were asking about that loose railing on the front porch, Sandra said, pulling out her phone to check messages. And I noticed the gutters need cleaning. Fall maintenance is so important, but it's dangerous work for someone your age, Mom. Someone your age. The phrase hung in the air like an accusation. Margaret was old, therefore vulnerable, therefore in need of management by her more capable younger family members. The logic was so smooth, so reasonable sounding, that Margaret might have accepted it herself just hours ago. I should probably get going, Sandra announced, glancing at her watch. Early day tomorrow, and you know how it is. Not getting any younger, any of us. The casual cruelty of the phrase hit Margaret like a slap. Sandra gathered her children efficiently, dispensing kisses and gathering their scattered belongings with the brisk competence of someone accustomed to managing multiple responsibilities. As the family prepared to leave, Margaret watched Sandra's final sweep of the living room, her eyes cataloging, assessing, planning. Emma hugged Margaret goodbye with genuine warmth, while Lucas pressed a crayon drawing into her hands, a picture of their family standing in front of what looked suspiciously like Margaret's house. See you soon, Grandma, Emma said softly, and Margaret heard layers of meaning in the simple words. The door closed behind them, leaving Margaret alone with the echo of Sandra's parting words and the growing realization that she needed to understand exactly how deep this betrayal ran before deciding how to protect herself. Part 3. Gathering. Intelligence. The silence that followed Sandra's departure felt different from the comfortable solitude Margaret had grown accustomed to since Gerald's death. This quiet carried weight, pressing against her ears with the density of secrets and unspoken assumptions. She stood at the front window, watching Sandra's taillights disappear around the corner, before allowing herself to sink into Gerald's old recliner. Lucas's crayon drawing lay in her lap, stick figures standing in front of a house that bore an unmistakable resemblance to her own, complete with the distinctive bay window and wraparound porch. The child had drawn himself and Emma significantly larger than the adult figures, as if they were the ones who truly belonged in the picture. Margaret's own representation appeared almost ghost-like, sketched in pale colors that seemed to fade into the background. For 30 minutes, she sat in the growing darkness, replaying every conversation from the past few months through her new lens of understanding. Sandra's increased visits, previously attributed to grief support, now seemed like reconnaissance missions. Robert's phone calls, once cherished connections with her distant son, might have been intelligence gathering disguised as filial concern. The grandfather clock in the hallway, another piece Sandra had apparently already mentally claimed, chimed 8 o'clock. Margaret reached for the cordless phone on the side table, her fingers moving automatically to dial Robert's number in Portland. If Sandra had been discussing Mom's situation, then Robert was certainly part of those conversations. "Mom!" Robert's voice carried genuine warmth when he answered, and for a moment Margaret's resolve wavered. "Perfect timing. I was just thinking about you." "Were you?" Margaret kept her tone light, casual. "That's sweet, honey. How are Jennifer? And the kids?" "Busy as always. Tyler made varsity soccer, and Sarah's applying for that early admission program we talked about." Robert's voice carried the familiar pride of a devoted father, and Margaret felt a pang of longing for the uncomplicated family relationships she'd thought she possessed just days ago. "That's wonderful." Margaret paused, then ventured carefully into her real purpose. "I've been thinking about you too, actually. About how far away you are when I might need help with things." The silence on Robert's end lasted just a beat too long. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted subtly, becoming more measured. "What kind of help are you thinking about, Mom?" "Oh, you know. The usual things that become more challenging as we age. Maintenance around the house, managing finances, making important decisions." Margaret watched her reflection in the dark window, noting how the woman looking back appeared smaller, more fragile than she'd realized. "Have you been having trouble with any of that?" Robert's question carried undertones Margaret had never noticed before, not concern for her well-being, but assessment of her competence. "Not trouble, exactly. But I've been wondering if I should start making plans, while I'm still mentally sharp enough to make good decisions." Margaret tested the waters with deliberate vulnerability. "That's actually really mature. Thinking, Mom." Robert's relief was audible. "Sandra and I were just talking about that the other day." Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. "Were you?" "We worry about you in that big house all alone. It's a lot of responsibility, and frankly, it's probably more space than you need at this stage of your life." Robert's words came easier now, as if he'd rehearsed this conversation. "There are some really nice senior communities around here, places where you could have your independence but also have support when you need it." Senior communities near Robert meant leaving. Her home, her neighborhood, her entire established life. Margaret realized with crystalline clarity that her children had already mapped out her future without consulting her preferences or desires. "And the house?" Margaret asked quietly. Another telling pause. "Well, obviously it would need to be sold to fund your new living situation. The market's really strong right now. Sandra's been looking into it. You could probably get enough to cover several years at a quality facility." Several years. As if Margaret's remaining lifespan were a finite resource to be budgeted and allocated. The casual calculation in Robert's voice made her stomach turn. "Sandra's been researching the market?" Margaret asked. "She's always been good with that kind of practical stuff," Robert said, and Margaret heard both gratitude and guilt in his tone. "I know I should be more involved, being the son and all, but with my job and the kids." Sandra's really stepped up to handle the details. The details of dismantling Margaret's life, apparently. "What kind of details?" "Property values, care facilities, legal stuff. She even talked to that lawyer who handled Dad's estate. What was his name? Chen? She wanted to understand what kind of planning might be involved. Margaret's breath caught. Sandra had contacted David Chen, Margaret's trusted attorney, without her knowledge or permission. The violation felt personal and professional simultaneously. That was thoughtful of her, Margaret managed. She really cares about making sure you're taken care of properly, Robert continued, warming to his theme. We both do. And honestly, Mom, some of the communities she's found look amazing. Much safer than living alone, and you'd have built-in social activities, meal services if you want them. Margaret closed her eyes, seeing her future as her children had planned it. A sterile apartment in an institutional setting, her independence traded for their peace of mind and financial benefit. No more garden to tend, no more familiar rooms filled with decades of memories, no more spontaneous visits from grandchildren who would grow up viewing her former home as their inheritance, rather than her sanctuary. I appreciate you both thinking. About my welfare, Margaret said carefully. We love you, Mom. We just want what's best for you. Robert's sincerity was devastating because Margaret realized he probably believed his own words. He'd convinced himself that displacing her from her home was an act of love rather than convenience. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. After ending the call, Margaret sat in darkness, processing the full scope of what she'd learned. Both her children had been planning her future without her input, researching her options as if she were incompetent to make her own decisions. They'd contacted her attorney, evaluated her property, and selected her living arrangements as if she were already mentally incapacitated. The phone rang again, almost immediately. Margaret glanced at the caller ID, Sandra's number. She let it ring twice before answering. Mom? Sandra's voice carried urgency. Robert just called. He said you were asking about getting help with things? Margaret smiled grimly in the darkness. The siblings' coordination was impressive in its efficiency, and chilling in its implications. Just exploring my options, dear, Margaret said calmly. Well, we should definitely talk about that, Sandra said quickly. Maybe over lunch tomorrow? I have some information that might be helpful. Information that had apparently been gathered, without Margaret's knowledge, evaluated without her input, and would now be presented as if it were entirely for her benefit. That would be lovely, Margaret agreed. Tomorrow, she decided, she would begin her own research. Part 4. The Confidant's Wisdom. Margaret woke before dawn, her sleep fractured by dreams of moving trucks and empty rooms. The house felt different. In the pre-morning darkness, not the comfortable sanctuary it had been for decades, but something more fragile, temporary. She moved through her morning routine mechanically, brewing coffee in the kitchen where she'd overheard her grandchildren, planning her posthumous legacy just 2 days ago. By 7:30, she was dressed and walking the 3 blocks to Helen Morrison's house, her steps purposeful despite the weight pressing against her chest. Helen would be in her garden by now, as she had been every morning for the 20 years. Margaret had known her. Some routines, Margaret thought bitterly, were more reliable than family loyalty. She found Helen exactly where expected, kneeling beside her rose bushes with pruning shears in hand. At 69, Helen moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to work around arthritis without surrendering to it. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and dirt already stained her gardening gloves. "You're early," Helen observed without looking up from her work. "And you look like hell." Margaret had always appreciated Helen's directness, but today it nearly broke her composure entirely. "I need to talk to someone." Helen glanced up then, taking in Margaret's expression with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Grab that watering can. We'll work while we talk." For 10 minutes, they moved through Helen's garden in companionable silence, Margaret following her friend's lead among the late-season chrysanthemums and October roses. The physical activity helped steady her breathing, while the beauty around them provided a stark contrast to the ugly truths she needed to voice. "Sandra and Robert have been planning my future," Margaret finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Without me." Helen's hand stilled on a particularly stubborn weed. "Planning how?" The words came in a rush then. The children's innocent game, Sandra's real estate research, Robert's casual discussion of senior communities and property sales. Helen listened without interruption, her expression growing darker with each revelation. "Those scheming little vultures," Helen said when Margaret finished. The venom in her friend's voice was oddly comforting. "How long do you think this has been going on?" "Months, at least. Maybe since Gerald died." Margaret sank onto Helen's garden bench, suddenly exhausted. "I keep thinking about conversations I dismissed, comments I thought were just concern for my well-being." Helen sat beside her, pulling off her gardening gloves with sharp movements. "Let me tell you something about family and money, Margaret. When my Charles died, I had 3 children suddenly very interested in my housing situation. Very concerned about me living alone in such a big house. Very helpful with suggestions about downsizing." Margaret looked at her friend with surprise. In 20 years of friendship, Helen had never mentioned family conflicts. "My daughter Karen actually had the nerve to suggest I move in with her into what used to be Charles's workshop that she wanted to convert into a granny flat." Helen's laugh was bitter. "Generous of her, considering my house is worth 3 times what theirs is. My son Michael kept dropping hints about how I should simplify my finances. Maybe let him help manage my investments." "What did you do?" "I got smart. Fast." Helen's voice carried steel Margaret had never heard before. "Changed my will, set up a trust, made it crystal clear that my assets were mine to control until the day I died. And you know what happened? Suddenly, their concern for my well-being became a lot less urgent." Margaret felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in days: hope. "They backed off?" "They had to. Couldn't circle the carcass anymore because I made it clear I wasn't dying anytime soon, and when I did, they'd get exactly what I chose to leave them. Not a penny more." Helen turned to face Margaret directly. "The point is, you have more power than you think. But only if you use it before they convince you you're too old and frail to make your own decisions." A car door slammed in front of Helen's house, interrupting their conversation. Both women looked toward the street to see Sandra's sedan parked at the curb, and Sandra herself walking up the garden path with determined strides. "Margaret," Sandra called out, her voice carrying forced cheer. "I saw you from the street. Perfect timing. We can walk back together for our lunch discussion." Margaret felt Helen stiffen beside her, and she realized her friend was getting her first direct look at the woman who had been planning Margaret's displacement with such calculating efficiency. "Hello, Sandra," Helen said coolly, rising from the bench. "How nice to see you taking such an interest in your mother's social activities." Sandra's smile flickered slightly at Helen's tone. "Mrs. Morrison, I hope you don't mind me stealing Mom away. We have some important family matters to discuss." "I'm sure you do," Helen replied, her meaning unmistakable. Margaret stood slowly, her mind racing. Sandra's unexpected appearance felt like surveillance rather than coincidence. Had she been watching Margaret's movements, monitoring her conversations? "I was just leaving anyway," Margaret said carefully, sensing undercurrents she didn't fully understand but recognizing the protective stance Helen had assumed. As they prepared to leave, Helen caught Margaret's arm gently. "Remember what we talked about," she said quietly. "You have options. Use them." Sandra's eyes sharpened at the exchange, but she maintained her pleasant demeanor as they walked back toward Margaret's house. "Mrs. Morrison seems to have strong opinions about family matters." "Helen's been a good friend for many years," Margaret said neutrally. "Of course, though sometimes outsiders don't fully understand family dynamics." "Do they?" Sandra's tone remained light, but Margaret heard the warning clearly. Helen was being categorized as an unwelcome influence, someone whose advice should be disregarded. They reached Margaret's front porch, where Sandra paused before entering. "Mom, I hope you know that everything Robert and I discuss about your future comes from love. We're not trying to control your life. We're trying to protect it." Margaret looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw both the caring child she'd raised and the calculating woman who had been researching property values behind her back. The contradiction was heartbreaking and terrifying simultaneously. "I know you believe that," Margaret said quietly, unlocking her front door. As they entered the house Sandra had apparently already mentally claimed, Margaret carried Helen's words with her like a talisman. "You have more power than you think. But only if you use it." The question was whether she had the courage to do exactly that. Part 5. Legal Realities. Margaret's lunch with Sandra had been a masterclass in manipulation disguised as concern. For 90 minutes, her daughter had presented a carefully researched portfolio of senior living facilities, each one farther from Margaret's established life than the last. Sandra's enthusiasm for active adult communities and supportive care environments had been punctuated by subtle reminders of Margaret's advancing age and the burdens of home ownership. The final straw had come when Sandra produced printed emails from David Chen's office, correspondence Margaret had never seen, discussing estate planning strategies Sandra claimed were routine updates following Gerald's death. The violation of privacy felt almost physical, a breach of trust that went beyond family dynamics into professional relationships Margaret had considered sacred. After Sandra left, armed with promises to think seriously about the materials she'd provided, Margaret sat in her kitchen with David Chen's business card in her trembling fingers. She'd found it in her address book, where it had remained undisturbed since Gerald's funeral arrangements. The familiar weight of the cardstock felt substantial in her hands, a tangible connection to the legal protections she hadn't realized she might need against her own children. At 3 o'clock exactly, Margaret dialed the number. "Mrs. Sullivan." David's voice carried immediate warmth when his secretary connected the call. "I'm so glad to hear from you. How are you managing?" "I need to see you," Margaret said without preamble. "As soon as possible." David's tone shifted to professional alertness. "Of course. Is everything all right?" Margaret chose her words carefully, aware that anything she said might eventually be repeated to Sandra if her daughter's previous contact with the attorney had established some form of ongoing relationship. "I have some questions about my estate, planning, and about what rights I have regarding my family's involvement in those decisions." The pause on David's end told Margaret he understood the subtext. "I can see you this afternoon if you'd like. 4:30? Margaret arrived at David Chen's office 20 minutes early, her hands clutching a folder containing every document Sandra had shown her during lunch. The law office occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian house downtown, its rooms retaining the warmth of residential architecture while conveying professional competence. Margaret had always felt comfortable here during her previous visits with Gerald, but today the familiar surroundings felt like a fortress she desperately needed to enter. David greeted her personally, leading her into his office with the courtesy that had made Gerald trust him implicitly. At 55, David possessed the careful bearing of someone who had spent decades handling family conflicts with diplomacy and discretion. His desk displayed photos of his own family alongside law books and client files, a reminder that he understood both professional and personal stakes. "Before we begin," David said, settling behind his desk, "I want to address something directly. Your daughter contacted my office several weeks ago asking general questions about estate planning procedures. I didn't provide any specific information about your situation, but I want you to know that conversation took place." Margaret's suspicions crystallized into cold certainty. "What kind of questions?" "Procedural matters mostly. How estates are typically settled, what documentation might be required, Timelines for property transfers. David's careful neutrality couldn't mask the implication. I told her that any specific questions about your estate would need to come directly from you. But she didn't mention that she had no authority to ask those questions. She didn't claim to have authority, David said carefully, but she also didn't clarify that you weren't aware of her inquiry. Margaret opened her folder and spread Sandra's materials across David's desk. She presented these to me today as routine updates following my husband's death. She's been researching senior living facilities, property values, and apparently, my legal options without my knowledge or consent. David examined the documents with the methodical attention Margaret remembered from Gerald's estate proceedings. His expression grew increasingly serious as he reviewed Sandra's research, particularly the financial projections that calculated Margaret's home value against care facility costs. "Mrs. Sullivan," David said finally, "what specific concerns do you have about your current estate plan?" Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her suspicions transform into spoken truth. "I'm concerned that my children view my death as a financial opportunity rather than a loss. And I'm concerned that they're making plans for my future without consulting me." David nodded slowly, his expression conveying both understanding and professional determination. "Let me explain your rights very clearly. First, your estate is yours to control completely until the moment you die. No one, not your children, not any family member, has any legal claim to your assets while you're alive and competent." The words felt like oxygen to someone who'd been slowly suffocating. "What about competency? How is that determined?" "Medical evaluation by qualified professionals. Not family opinions, not assumptions based on age, not pressure from relatives who think they know what's best for you." David's voice carried the authority of someone who had fought these battles before. "You're 72, not incapacitated. You have every right to make your own decisions about where you live, how you spend your money, and what happens to your property." Margaret felt strength returning to her voice. "What can I do to protect myself?" David pulled out a legal pad and began writing. "Several options. We can establish a revocable living trust that gives you complete control during your lifetime while preventing your heirs from contesting your decisions. We can create specific bequests that make your intentions absolutely clear. We can establish healthcare directives that prevent anyone from making medical decisions without your explicit consent. And if they challenge any of this, they can try, but it would be expensive and ultimately unsuccessful if we document your competency and decision-making capacity properly." David met her eyes directly. "The key is acting while you're clearly capable of making informed decisions. Waiting until you actually need assistance gives family members more legal leverage to question your choices." Margaret absorbed this information, feeling pieces of a protective strategy falling into place. "How long would this take?" "We can have basic protections in place within a week. More comprehensive planning might take a month." David leaned forward. "But Mrs. Sullivan, I need to ask, are you making these changes because you want different outcomes for your estate, or because you want to maintain control over the timing and circumstances of those outcomes?" The question cut to the heart of Margaret's dilemma. She didn't want to punish her children, but she refused to be treated as an incompetent obstacle to their financial planning. "I want them to see me as their mother, not their inheritance," Margaret said quietly. "And I want to make my own decisions about my life for as long as I'm capable of making them." David smiled for the first time during their meeting. "Then, we have work to do." As Margaret scheduled her follow-up appointment, she felt something she hadn't experienced in days: control over her own destiny. The knowledge that she had legal options restored a sense of agency that her children's presumptions had nearly destroyed. Walking to her car, Margaret realized Helen had been absolutely right. She did have more power than she'd thought. Now she just needed the courage to use it. Part 6. The Test. Margaret spent 3 days after her meeting with David Chen rehearsing the conversation in her mind. Driving home alone, Margaret realized her test had succeeded beyond her worst expectations. Her children weren't just hoping for her eventual death. They were actively monitoring her independence to prevent any actions that might diminish their inheritance. The knowledge hurt worse than she'd anticipated, but it also crystallized her resolve. She would not be managed, manipulated, or treated as an incompetent obstacle to their financial planning. It was time to take control. Part 7. The Plan. Margaret woke Monday morning with a clarity she hadn't felt in months. The weekend's revelation had stripped away the last vestiges of doubt about her children's motivations, leaving her free to act. Without the burden of familial sentiment clouding her judgment, she made coffee with deliberate precision, treating the mundane ritual as preparation for the larger orchestration ahead. By 9 o'clock, she was seated across from David Chen's desk again, this time carrying a leather portfolio that contained 3 months of careful research. She'd spent Sunday mapping out her strategy with the thoroughness of a military campaign, cross-referencing legal precedents, financial options, and timeline considerations. "I need to restructure everything," she announced without preamble. "My will, my assets, my entire approach to estate planning." David's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained professionally neutral. "That's certainly your prerogative, Margaret. What specific changes are you considering?" Margaret opened her portfolio and withdrew a typed list. "First, I want to establish a revocable living trust. I'll serve as trustee during my lifetime, but I want complete flexibility to modify terms as circumstances change." Reasonable approach. It provides privacy and avoids probate complications. "Second, I want to liquidate the house." This time, David's composure cracked slightly. "You're serious about selling?" "Completely serious. I've already contacted 3 real estate agents for market assessments. Current estimates range from $380,000 to $420,000. Even at the conservative end, that's substantial liquidity." David made notes as she spoke, his pen scratching across legal paper with increasing frequency. "And your plans for the proceeds?" Margaret smiled with genuine pleasure for the first time in weeks. "That's where it gets interesting. I've researched several investment options, but I'm particularly drawn to structured charitable giving. Charitable remainder trusts, among other vehicles. I want to establish multiple income streams that benefit causes I care about while providing me with steady payments during my lifetime. The children will inherit whatever remains, but the bulk will go toward education scholarships, animal welfare, and medical research." David leaned back in his chair, studying Margaret with new respect. "This represents a significant philosophical shift from your previous planning." "My previous planning assumed children who cared about my welfare rather than my net worth." The lawyer's expression darkened with understanding. "I see. And your timeline for implementation?" Margaret consulted her notes with the satisfaction of someone who'd done her homework thoroughly. "I want the house listed within 2 weeks. I've identified a luxury senior living community in Asheville that offers month-to-month arrangements for prospective residents. I can move there temporarily while I explore longer-term options." "Asheville? That's quite a distance from your current support network." "Exactly the point. I need space to make decisions without constant interference from well-meaning family members who confuse their financial interests with my best interests." David's pen moved steadily across his notepad as Margaret outlined her vision with increasing animation. She wanted to establish the charitable trust immediately, transfer the house sale proceeds within 30 days of closing, and create a new will that reflected her evolved understanding of family dynamics. "There's one more element I'd like to discuss," Margaret continued, reaching for a second folder. "I want to create what I call transparency provisions in my estate planning." "Meaning?" "I want my children to understand exactly how their behavior has influenced my decisions. not as punishment, but as education. The new will should include a detailed letter explaining my reasoning, along with documentation of their various suggestions about my competency and need for assistance. David's expression grew thoughtful. That's unusual, but not unprecedented. Some clients find it therapeutic to provide context for their choices. I want them to understand that their inheritance isn't an entitlement. It's a reflection of our relationship's genuine quality, not their birth order or genetic connection. Margaret spent the next hour detailing specific provisions, her voice growing stronger as she articulated plans that restored her sense of agency. She wanted performance benchmarks for any bequests to her children, requirements that they demonstrate actual concern for her welfare rather than her assets before receiving significant inheritances. For instance, she explained, Sandra receives her full bequest only if she can demonstrate 6 months of regular contact that doesn't involve financial discussions or suggestions about my living arrangements. Robert's inheritance requires similar engagement without his persistent offers to help manage my affairs. David looked up from his extensive notes. These provisions will need careful legal crafting to be enforceable. I understand, but I want accountability built into my legacy. They should inherit based on their actual relationship with me, not their genetic lottery ticket. The meeting concluded with David promising draft documents within 10 days. Margaret left his office feeling lighter than she had in months, as if she'd shed invisible chains that had constrained her thinking. Her next stop was Patterson Real Estate, where she'd scheduled consultations with the 3 agents who'd provided market estimates. She chose Jennifer Morrison, a seasoned professional who understood the emotional complexity of selling a long-time family home while respecting Margaret's clear determination to proceed. When would you like to list? Jennifer asked, after reviewing the property details. This week, if possible. I want a quick sale to someone who'll appreciate the house's character. Jennifer nodded approvingly. The market's strong for properties in your price range. With minimal staging and competitive pricing, we should see significant interest within days. Margaret authorized professional photography and staging consultation, then returned home to begin the daunting task of sorting through 43 years of accumulated possessions. She approached the project systematically, room by room, dividing items into categories: keep, donate, sell, and discard. The process proved surprisingly liberating. Each decision to release an object felt like shedding unnecessary weight, as if she were streamlining her life for a journey that required traveling light. She kept photographs, important documents, and items with genuine sentimental value while releasing furniture, dishes, and decorative objects that had become burdens, rather than treasures. By Wednesday, professional photographers were capturing the house's best angles while Margaret finalized her temporary housing arrangements in Asheville. The senior community offered furnished apartments with flexible terms, perfect for her transitional needs. Thursday brought the first showing requests, and Margaret realized she needed to inform her children about the sale before they learned about it through neighborhood gossip or online listings. She called Sandra first, choosing directness over diplomacy. I wanted you to know that I've listed the house, she announced without preamble. The silence stretched so long that Margaret wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Sandra's voice returned, tight with barely controlled emotion. You can't be serious. Completely serious. The listing goes active tomorrow. But you promised you wouldn't make drastic decisions without talking to us. Margaret smiled at her daughters. Selective memory. I promised I wouldn't do anything without talking to you first. This conversation fulfills that promise. Sandra's protest dissolved into spluttering indignation before the call ended abruptly. Robert's reaction proved more measured but equally distressed, his diplomatic training allowing him to express concern without the raw panic that had characterized Sandra's response. By Friday evening, Margaret sat in her empty living room, the furniture already donated or sold. watching car headlights sweep past the for sale sign in her front yard. The house felt different already, less like a prison of memory and more like a launching pad for whatever came next. Her phone buzzed with increasingly frantic messages from both children, but Margaret felt no urgency to respond. She had taken control of her narrative, her assets, and her future. The children would adapt or they wouldn't, but they would no longer dictate the terms of her independence. For the first time in months, Margaret fell asleep smiling. Part 8. The Reckoning. The first offer came within 36 hours of the listing, going live, followed by 2 more before the weekend ended. Margaret reviewed each proposal with Jennifer Morrison on Monday morning, her satisfaction evident as she noted the competitive prices that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. The Hendersons' offer is particularly strong, Jennifer explained, spreading the contracts across Margaret's kitchen table. Full asking price, minimal contingencies, and they can close in 3 weeks. They're a young family relocating from California. They see the house exactly as you've maintained it, a family home with character and care. Margaret signed the acceptance papers with steady hands, officially severing her 43-year connection to the address that had defined her adult identity. The relief was immediate and profound, as if she'd been holding her breath for months and could finally exhale completely. Her phone had been ringing constantly since Friday's listing announcement, but Margaret answered only calls from Jennifer, David Chen, or the Asheville senior community. Sandra and Robert's increasingly desperate messages accumulated in her voicemail, a digital record of their mounting panic as they realized the extent of her independence. By Tuesday, both children had apparently coordinated their response. Margaret returned from grocery shopping to find Sandra's car in her driveway and Robert's rental sedan parked behind it. They waited on her front porch with the grim determination of an intervention committee, their expressions mixing concern with barely controlled anger. "Mom, we need to talk," Sandra announced before Margaret could reach the front door. "I suppose you do," Margaret replied calmly, unlocking the house with deliberate slowness. "Though I'm not sure what about. I've made my decisions quite clearly." Robert followed her inside, his diplomatic demeanor strained to its limits. "Mom, this is madness. You can't just uproot your entire life without considering the consequences." Margaret set her groceries on the kitchen counter and turned to face her children with the serene confidence of someone who'd already fought and won the most important battle. "I've considered the consequences extensively. That's precisely why I'm making these changes." Sandra's composure cracked first. "You're being manipulated. Someone's gotten to you, convinced you to make decisions that go against everything you've ever wanted." Actually, quite the opposite. For the first time in months, I'm making decisions based entirely on what I want, without worrying about anyone else's financial expectations. The phrase hit its target with precision. Both children's faces tightened as they realized their mother had identified their primary concern with uncomfortable accuracy. Robert attempted damage control. "That's not fair, Mom. We've only ever wanted what's best for you." Margaret moved to the living room, where empty shelves and packed boxes provided stark evidence of her commitment to change. She settled into her remaining chair, a comfortable reading chair she planned to keep, and gestured for her children to sit on the folding chairs Jennifer had brought for showings. "Let me tell you what I think is best for me," Margaret began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent considerable time examining her situation. "What's best for me is living without the constant undercurrent of assessment, without conversations that pretend to be about my welfare while actually calculating my net worth." Sandra's face flushed red. "That's not what we were doing." "Isn't it?" Margaret reached for a folder she'd prepared for this inevitable confrontation. "I have notes here from our conversations over the past few months. Shall I read some highlights?" She opened the folder and began reading in the measured tone of someone presenting evidence. "Mom, you're not getting any younger, and decisions like this become more difficult as time goes on. That was you, Robert, when I mentioned possibly updating my will. Or this one from Sandra. We just think you should have professional help managing all these financial details. It's too much responsibility for one person. Both children shifted uncomfortably as Margaret continued her recitation, their own. Words reflecting back the calculating nature of their concern. Here's my personal favorite, Margaret continued. The important thing is making sure everything is properly organized for the future, so there aren't complications later. Robert again, discussing my estate planning as if I were already dead, and he were settling my affairs. Robert's diplomatic training finally failed him. For God's sake, Mom, we're your children. We have a legitimate interest in your welfare and your future. You have a legitimate interest in our relationship, Margaret corrected firmly. You have no legitimate interest in my assets or my decisions about how to use them. Sandra stood abruptly, pacing to the window where the under-contract rider had been added to the for sale sign. This is insane. You're throwing away our family home, our history, everything we've built together. I'm not throwing anything away. I'm choosing how to live the remainder of my life without constantly justifying my independence to people who view it as a threat to their inheritance. The word inheritance hung in the air like an accusation. Neither child attempted to deny its significance, their silence confirming what Margaret had suspected for months. Robert tried a different approach, his voice taking on the reasonable tone he used in business negotiations. Look, if this is about feeling unappreciated or taken for granted, we can work on that. We can visit more often, call more regularly. But selling the house? Moving away? That's irreversible. Margaret smiled with genuine amusement. You're right. It is irreversible. That's exactly the point. I want to make decisions that can't be undone by your renewed attention once you realize your financial interests are at stake. Sandra whirled from the window, her composure completely shattered. Financial interests? You're our mother. We love you. I know you love me, Margaret said quietly, but I also know you love the idea of inheriting this house and my investments. The question is whether you can love me without viewing me as a carefully managed asset. The conversation continued for another hour, cycling through recriminations, protestations of innocent motives, and increasingly desperate attempts to convince Margaret she was making a terrible mistake. Through it all, Margaret remained calm, occasionally consulting her folder of documented conversations to counter their revisionist accounts of their own behavior. Finally, Robert played what he clearly considered his trump card. Fine. If you're determined to do this, at least let us help. We can research communities together, visit options, make sure you're making informed decisions. Margaret's laugh was sharp and knowing. So you can steer me toward choices that preserve as much of your inheritance as possible? No, thank you. Sandra burst into tears. Whether from frustration, genuine grief, or calculated manipulation, Margaret couldn't determine and no longer cared. You're destroying our family, Sandra sobbed. How can you be so cruel? I'm not destroying anything, Margaret replied. I'm revealing what already existed. If our family relationship was built on your expectation of inheriting my property, then it was already broken. The children left shortly after, their departure marked by Sandra's dramatic sobbing and Robert's cold promise that they wouldn't enable this self-destructive behavior. Margaret watched their cars disappear down the street and felt nothing but relief. The following weeks passed in a blur of efficient activity. The house closing proceeded smoothly, with the Henderson family proving to be exactly the kind of buyers Margaret had hoped for, people who saw her home as a beginning rather than an asset to be liquidated. She attended the closing with a sense of completion rather than loss, signing papers that freed her from both mortgage payments and family expectations. Her move to Asheville felt like stepping into a different life entirely. The senior community Jennifer had recommended proved to be everything the brochures had promised. Active adults pursuing interests that had nothing to do with managing their children's expectations or preserving their legacies for ungrateful heirs. Margaret's temporary apartment came furnished with elegant simplicity, everything she needed and nothing she didn't. The community offered amenities she'd never considered: fitness classes, book clubs, travel groups, and volunteer opportunities that allowed her to engage with the world on her own terms. Within a month, she'd joined a hiking group that explored the Blue Ridge Mountains every Tuesday, a wine tasting club that met Thursday evenings, and a volunteer program that paired community residents with literacy students at the local community college. For the first time in years, her calendar filled with activities she'd chosen based on her interests rather than family obligations. The financial restructuring proceeded exactly as planned. David Chen had crafted elegant legal documents that established her charitable remainder trust, providing Margaret with steady income while ensuring the bulk of her estate would fund causes she cared about rather than her children's assumptions about their birthright. Her new investment advisor, recommended by the community's financial planning services, helped her understand the power of her position. The house sale, combined with her existing savings and the structured charitable giving arrangements, provided her with more monthly income than she'd had during her working years. "You've essentially bought yourself complete independence," he explained during one of their quarterly reviews. "You can live very well without depleting principal, and the charitable components provide significant tax advantages." Margaret found herself sleeping better than she had in years, waking each morning with anticipation rather than dread. The absence of constant worry about her children's judgments and manipulations left space for rediscovering interests she'd neglected during decades of caretaking and family management. She took up watercolor painting again, joining a weekly class where her fellow students were accomplished professionals, retirees pursuing delayed dreams, and people like herself who'd decided that age was no barrier to learning new skills. Her paintings weren't masterpieces, but the process of creating something beautiful from blank paper provided satisfaction she'd forgotten was possible. The children maintained sporadic contact, their calls and messages cycling through anger, guilt-inducing manipulation, and occasional attempts at reconciliation. Margaret responded selectively, engaging only when their communication focused on her well-being rather than their disapproval of her choices. Sandra's messages proved particularly revealing, alternating between tearful apologies and angry accusations. One particularly memorable voicemail began with, "I'm sorry we made you feel unappreciated," and concluded with, "But you can't just abandon your responsibilities to your family." Margaret saved that message as a perfect encapsulation of her children's inability to separate her worth as a person from her value as an inheritance source. Robert's approach was more sophisticated but equally transparent. His communications arrived in the form of articles about elder financial abuse, research studies on the psychological effects of major life changes in seniors, and carefully worded expressions of concern about her isolation from family support systems. Margaret responded to neither child's campaigns, recognizing them as extensions of the same dynamic that had prompted her escape. They wanted her to return to her previous role as a carefully managed asset, and she had no intention of accommodating that expectation. 3 months into her Asheville adventure, Margaret received a call from David Chen with news that crystallized her satisfaction with her choices. Sandra had consulted another attorney about challenging Margaret's competency and the validity of her recent legal documents. The attorney apparently explained that competency challenges require substantial evidence of cognitive impairment or undue influence, David reported with barely concealed amusement. "Since you're clearly functioning at full capacity and made these decisions independently, there's no basis for legal action." Margaret laughed out loud at the news. "So they've moved from subtle manipulation to outright legal challenges. That's actually reassuring. It confirms I was right about their priorities." The other attorney did mention that your daughter seemed particularly upset about the charitable components of your estate planning. "Of course she is. It's harder to justify challenging gifts to educational scholarships and medical research then challenging gifts to a supposedly incompetent mother. As spring arrived in the North Carolina mountains, Margaret realized she'd accomplished something she hadn't expected when she'd first walked into David Chen's office. She'd created a life that belonged entirely to herself. Her days were full of activities she'd chosen, relationships she'd cultivated, and purposes she'd identified based on her own values rather than family expectations. The house sale had provided more than financial freedom. It had severed the last chain binding her to a role she'd outgrown. She was no longer anyone's mother, inheritance source, or carefully managed responsibility. She was simply Margaret, a woman in her 70s who'd discovered that independence could be claimed at any age if one had the courage to seize it. Part 9. New Foundations. 6 months after her move to Asheville, Margaret stood in the community garden she'd helped establish, watching sunrise paint the Blue Ridge Mountains in shades of gold and rose. Her hands were dirty from transplanting tomato seedlings, her back ached pleasantly from honest work, and her mind was clear in ways she'd forgotten were possible. The woman who'd once measured her days by family obligations and inheritance anxieties had evolved into someone who measured time by seasonal plantings and volunteer commitments. The garden project had started during her second month at Ridgeview Senior Community, when she'd mentioned to fellow resident Eleanor Vasquez that the courtyard's unused corner would be perfect for growing vegetables. Eleanor, a retired agricultural extension agent, had embraced the idea with infectious enthusiasm, and together they'd convinced the community management to approve a pilot program. What began as a modest herb garden had expanded into a thriving operation that supplied fresh produce to the community kitchen, with surplus donated to the local food bank. Margaret found profound satisfaction in nurturing growth, in working with soil and seeds to create something beautiful and useful. The metaphor wasn't lost on her. She was cultivating new life in previously barren ground, both literally and figuratively. "You're up early again," Eleanor observed, approaching with 2 steaming cups of coffee. At 78, Eleanor moved with the efficient grace of someone who'd spent decades managing both farmland and family, and her friendship had become one of Margaret's most treasured discoveries. "Best time of day," Margaret replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Everything's possible in the morning." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, their movements synchronized by months of collaboration. Eleanor had become the sister Margaret had never had, a relationship built on mutual respect and shared interests rather than biological obligation. Their friendship operated without the undercurrents of judgment or expectation that had poisoned Margaret's family relationships. "Speaking of possibilities," Eleanor said eventually, "have you given any more thought to James Patterson's dinner invitation?" Margaret's hands stilled among the pepper plants. James Patterson was a widower from the community's North Building, a retired history professor whose wife had died 3 years earlier. He'd been circling Margaret's social orbit for weeks, their conversations at community events growing longer and more personal. Yesterday, he'd finally worked up the courage to suggest dinner at the local farm-to-table restaurant everyone raved about. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of complication," Margaret admitted. Eleanor's laugh was knowing and gentle. "Honey, at our age, dinner isn't that complicated. It's just dinner, with someone who finds you interesting and attractive." The concept still felt foreign to Margaret. After Harold's death, she'd assumed romantic companionship was finished for her, that she'd enter a phase of dignified widowhood focused on family and gradual decline. The possibility of new romantic connection had never factored into her planning. What if it changes things? What if it gets messy? "What if it doesn't?" Eleanor countered. "What if it's just nice to have dinner with an intelligent man who likes your company? You've spent months learning to live for yourself. Maybe it's time to learn to enjoy yourself too." Margaret considered this as they finished their morning gardening. The truth was, she found James Patterson intriguing. He was well-read, politically engaged, and had a dry sense of humor that complemented her own. Their conversations ranged From local politics to historical analysis to shared observations about their fellow residents' romantic dramas. He treated her as an intellectual equal, never once suggesting she needed help managing her affairs or making decisions. "I'll think about it," Margaret promised, though she already knew she'd say yes. The realization surprised her. When had she become someone who took social risks for the possibility of enjoyment? Her phone buzzed with a text message, interrupting her contemplation. Sandra's name appeared on the screen, and Margaret's good mood dimmed slightly. Her daughter's communications had become less frequent but more strategically timed, arriving just when Margaret seemed most settled, as if Sandra had developed a sixth sense for disrupting her mother's peace. "Emergency with Emma's college tuition. Can we talk today? Really need your advice." Margaret sighed, recognizing the familiar pattern. Sandra's emergencies invariably involved financial stress that could allegedly be solved by Margaret's intervention. The requests had evolved from subtle suggestions about returning home to direct appeals for monetary assistance, each framed as a temporary crisis that justified abandoning Margaret's selfish pursuit of independence. Eleanor read Margaret's expression accurately. "Family again? Sandra thinks her daughter needs tuition help. And you think Sandra thinks you should provide it?" Margaret showed Eleanor the message, watching her friend's face harden with recognition. Eleanor had her own stories about adult children who viewed their parents as emergency funding sources, relationships that confused love with financial dependence. "What does your financial advisor say about your charitable giving budget?" Margaret smiled at Eleanor's diplomatic phrasing. Her friend knew about the structured giving plan that directed most of Margaret's estate toward scholarships and medical research, but she also knew Margaret maintained discretionary funds for genuine family emergencies. "He says I can afford to help with legitimate crises, but I should distinguish between actual emergencies and manufactured urgency designed to manipulate my sympathy." "Sounds like good advice. What's your gut telling you?" Margaret considered the question honestly. Sandra's financial difficulties weren't fabricated. She knew her daughter and son-in-law struggled with credit card debt, mortgage payments, and the escalating costs of raising teenagers. But Sandra's approach to these challenges invariably involved searching for external solutions rather than examining her family's spending patterns or lifestyle choices. More troubling was Sandra's transparent assumption that Margaret's newfound financial independence existed primarily to solve Sandra's problems. Every conversation eventually circled back to suggestions that Margaret's excessive, charitable giving could be redirected toward more practical family support. "My gut says Sandra needs to learn the difference between wanting my help and needing my help," Margaret replied finally. She typed a careful response. "I'd be happy to discuss Emma's college plans. Let me know when you can call this evening." The message struck a balance between maternal availability and personal boundaries. Margaret would listen to Sandra's concerns, but she wouldn't be manipulated into hasty financial decisions designed to bypass her careful budgeting and planning. Eleanor nodded approvingly. "You're getting good at this. Practice makes perfect, unfortunately." They finished their gardening and walked back toward the main building, where morning activities were beginning. Margaret had signed up for the community's investment club, a group of residents who pooled knowledge and resources to make informed financial decisions. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd gone from being treated as financially incompetent by her children to actively educating other seniors about portfolio management and estate planning. The investment club met in the community's conference room, a bright space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the mountains. Margaret arrived to find 12 other residents already assembled, their morning coffee and notebooks indicating serious intentions. Club President Ruth Morrison, Jennifer's mother-in-law and a retired CPA, called the meeting to order with efficient authority. "Today we're reviewing quarterly performance and discussing rebalancing strategies," Ruth announced. "Margaret, would you update us on the charitable remainder trust structure you implemented? Several members have expressed interest in similar arrangements." Margaret found herself presenting to the group with confidence that would have seemed impossible during her months of family manipulation. She explained how charitable trusts could provide steady income while supporting meaningful causes, answering detailed questions about tax implications and beneficiary designations. The key advantage, she concluded, is maintaining control over your assets while ensuring they're used according to your values rather than your heirs' expectations. The comment drew knowing nods from several members who'd dealt with their own family financial pressures. Margaret realized she'd found her tribe, people who understood the difference between being financially responsible and being financially controlled. After the meeting, she stopped by the community's business center to review her monthly statements. The numbers confirmed what she already knew. Her restructured finances provided more security and flexibility than she'd ever enjoyed. The house. Sale proceeds, invested through her charitable trust arrangement, generated monthly income that exceeded her living expenses while building toward substantial future donations. She was, by any objective measure, thriving financially. The knowledge made Sandra's impending crisis conversation feel particularly manipulative. Margaret spent the afternoon volunteering at the community college's literacy center, working with adult students who were pursuing their GED certificates. Her student today was Maria Gonzalez, a 35-year-old single mother who cleaned offices at night and studied during her children's school hours. "I never thought I was smart enough for college," Maria confided as they worked through algebra problems. "My family said I should focus on practical things, not waste time on education." Margaret felt a familiar stab of recognition. Sometimes the people who love us think they're protecting us by limiting our dreams. "But you went to college, right? You seem so confident about everything." The question made Margaret pause. "I went to college, yes. But I'm just learning to be confident about my own decisions. It's never too late to start thinking for yourself." They worked together for another hour, Maria's growing mastery of mathematical concepts providing Margaret with vicarious satisfaction. Watching someone discover their own capabilities reminded Margaret of her recent personal journey. The revelation that competence and confidence could be cultivated at any age. Margaret returned to her apartment that evening to find a voicemail from Robert, his diplomatic tone barely concealing frustration. "Mom, Sandra mentioned she's reaching out about Emma's college situation. I wanted to coordinate with you before you make any commitments. There are tax implications to consider, and I think we should discuss the most strategic approach to family financial support." The message crystallized everything Margaret had learned about her children's priorities. Robert wasn't concerned about Emma's education or Sandra's stress. He was worried about Margaret making financial decisions without his oversight. He still viewed her as an asset requiring professional management, despite months of evidence that she was perfectly capable of managing her own affairs. Margaret deleted the voicemail without responding. She'd deal with Sandra's request on its own merits, without Robert's strategic input or coordination. At 7 o'clock, Sandra called with the exhausted desperation Margaret recognized from years of parenting. "Mom, I don't know what we're going to do. Emma got accepted to state, but the financial aid package isn't enough. We're short about $8,000 for the first year." Margaret listened patiently as Sandra detailed the family's financial calculations, noting how the explanation focused entirely on the funding gap without acknowledging any responsibility for the situation. Sandra and her husband had apparently assumed their daughter would receive full financial aid without researching the actual requirements or developing backup plans. "What options have you explored?" Margaret asked carefully. "Well, we thought maybe you could help. I know you have that trust thing set up, but this is for Emma's education. Surely that's the kind of thing you'd want to support." The assumption was breathtaking in its audacity. Sandra wanted Margaret to redirect charitable funds designated for educational scholarships toward her own daughter's tuition, as if Emma's college expenses took priority over Margaret's carefully planned giving strategies. "Have you considered student loans, work-study programs, Emma working part-time to contribute to her expenses?" Sandra's silence suggested these options hadn't received serious consideration. "Mom, we can't saddle her with debt right from the start, and she needs to focus on her studies, not work some minimum wage job." Margaret recognized the familiar pattern. Sandra's family wanted the benefits of higher education without accepting responsibility for its costs. They expected Margaret to bridge the gap between their desires and their resources, treating her financial independence as a family asset rather than a personal achievement. "I understand this is stressful," Margaret said gently, "but $8,000 is a significant amount, and I need to consider how it fits with my overall financial planning." "Your overall financial planning?" Sandra's voice sharpened with disbelief. "She's your granddaughter." "Yes, she is, and I love her dearly, but that doesn't make me responsible for funding her education when her parents haven't exhausted other options." The conversation deteriorated from there, Sandra's initial request morphing into tearful accusations about Margaret's selfishness and abandonment of family responsibilities. Margaret listened with the detached calm of someone who'd heard these arguments before and recognized their manipulative structure. "I'm not saying no," Margaret said finally. "I'm saying I need to consider this request carefully, in the context of Emma's actual needs versus your family's preferences." Sandra hung up without saying goodbye, her frustration evident in the sharp click of disconnection. Margaret set down her phone and made herself tea, processing the conversation with interest rather than guilt. 6 months ago, Sandra's emotional manipulation would have triggered immediate anxiety and defensive capitulation. Now, Margaret recognized the tactics and felt no compulsion to provide instant solutions to problems her daughter's family had created through poor planning. Her phone rang again 20 minutes later, Robert's name appearing on the screen. Margaret almost let it go to voicemail, but curiosity about his coordination efforts prompted her to answer. "Mom, Sandra called me very upset. I think there's been some miscommunication about Emma's college situation." "No miscommunication. Sandra asked for $8,000. I told her I'd consider the request carefully." "But Mom, this is family. This is exactly the kind of situation where your financial resources should be available." Margaret marveled at Robert's assumption that her money existed primarily to solve his family's problems. "My financial resources are available for things I choose to support. That includes family members who demonstrate genuine need rather than inadequate planning. Emma's education isn't inadequate planning. It's an investment in her future. An investment that her parents should have prepared for over the past 18 years rather than assuming I'd cover any shortfalls." Robert's diplomatic composure cracked slightly. "So, you're just going to let your granddaughter struggle with student loans because you want to punish Sandra?" The accusation was so fundamentally wrong that Margaret almost laughed. "I'm going to make decisions about my money based on what I think is best for everyone involved, including Emma. Sometimes that means letting young people take responsibility for their choices rather than rescuing them from natural consequences." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, Robert cycling through various approaches: reasoned argument, emotional appeal, veiled threats about family relationships, before finally accepting that Margaret wouldn't be swayed by immediate pressure. After hanging up, Margaret sat in her quiet apartment, processing the evening's family drama with surprising equanimity. The conversations that would once have triggered sleepless nights of guilty second-guessing now felt like minor interruptions in her otherwise satisfying life. She thought about Maria Gonzalez, working multiple jobs to fund her own education, approaching learning with gratitude and determination that Sandra's family couldn't imagine. She thought about the scholarship recipients who would benefit from her charitable trust, students who'd overcome significant obstacles to pursue education without expecting family members to eliminate financial challenges. Margaret opened her laptop and composed a careful email to Emma directly. "Dear Emma, your mother mentioned that you're facing a funding gap for college. I'm so proud of your acceptance to state and want to support your educational goals in a way that helps you develop independence and responsibility. I'd like to propose a matching program. For every dollar you earn through work study or part-time employment toward your tuition, I'll contribute a matching dollar, up to $4,000 per year. This way, you'll graduate with both a degree and valuable work experience, plus the knowledge that you've contributed significantly to your own success. If you're interested in this arrangement, we can discuss the details when you're ready. Love, Grandma Margaret. Margaret sent the email before she could second-guess herself, then called Eleanor to suggest they accept James Patterson's dinner invitation for the following weekend. If she was going to be accused of selfishness anyway, she might as well enjoy the benefits of putting her own happiness first. For the first time in decades, Margaret fell asleep looking forward to tomorrow rather than dreading the next family crisis. She'd built a life that belonged entirely to herself, and she had no intention of apologizing for its success. Part 10. Full Circle. Emma's response arrived 3 days later, bypassing her parents entirely with a direct email to Margaret's account. Dear Grandma Margaret, thank you for your offer about college funding. Mom and Dad are upset that you contacted me directly, but I'm glad you did. I've been feeling weird about the whole situation anyway. I got a work-study position in the library and applied for a weekend bookstore job. I know Mom thinks I should focus only on studying, but I actually want to work. Most of my friends have jobs, and I feel spoiled being the only one whose parents handle everything. I wanted to say I'm sorry about how Mom and Uncle Robert have been acting. I don't understand all the details, but I think what you did was brave. I hope when I'm your age, I'm as independent as you are. Love, Emma. Margaret read the email twice, her heart swelling with pride for her granddaughter's maturity. Emma had inherited Margaret's capacity for independent thought, despite being raised in a family that discouraged such autonomy. She immediately called Emma that weekend to discuss the matching program details. The conversation lasted an hour, Emma asking thoughtful questions while sharing her excitement about college and career plans. Margaret found herself genuinely proud of her granddaughter's wisdom, qualities that had developed despite rather than because of Sandra's parenting approach. I calculated that if I work part-time at both jobs, I can earn about $15,000 during the school year, Emma explained. With your matching funds, that would cover almost all my expenses except room and board. Margaret was impressed by Emma's mathematical precision and planning. This was exactly the kind of responsibility and forward thinking she'd hoped to encourage. Meanwhile, Margaret's own life continued blossoming in unexpected ways. Her dinner with James Patterson had been everything she'd hoped for: engaging conversation, genuine laughter, and the comfortable feeling of being valued for her thoughts and company rather than managed for her assets. I have to confess, James had said over dessert, I've been wanting to ask you out for months, but I wasn't sure if you were interested in this kind of companionship. Margaret had smiled at his diplomatic phrasing. I wasn't sure either, honestly. It's been so long since I thought about myself as someone who might date. Their relationship developed naturally over the following months. Symphony performances, long walks on community trails, and increasingly frequent conversations about shared interests and values. James treated her as an intellectual equal, never, once suggesting she needed help managing her affairs. Sandra's reaction to the formalized matching program was swift and predictably negative. She appeared at Margaret's apartment on a Thursday afternoon, having driven from her hometown without advance notice. Mom, we need to talk about this Emma situation, Sandra announced, pushing past Margaret into the apartment. This matching program thing is ridiculous. You're making everything unnecessarily complicated when you could just help pay for her education like a normal grandmother. Margaret settled into her reading chair calmly. I am helping pay for her education. I'm contributing up to $4,000 per year. But only if she works. You're forcing an 18-year-old to juggle employment with full-time studies instead of just writing a check. Margaret studied her daughter's agitated expression, recognizing the familiar pattern. Every complaint focused on the inconvenience of Margaret's approach, rather than its benefits for Emma's development. Have you considered that Emma might benefit from working, that she might develop skills and confidence she wouldn't gain from simply receiving money? Sandra's laugh was bitter. Mom, you're 73 years old. You don't understand what college is like now. Emma needs to focus on her grades, not waste time on minimum wage jobs. The condescension was breathtaking, but Margaret felt no anger, only clarity about Sandra's fundamental inability to see beyond her own narrow perspective. Emma seems to understand the value of work quite well, Margaret replied calmly. She's excited about the library position and confident she can balance employment with academics. Sandra's composure finally cracked. This is all about punishing us, isn't it? You're mad that we questioned some of your decisions, so now you're taking it out on our children. The accusation revealed everything about Sandra's worldview. She genuinely couldn't conceive of decisions that weren't motivated by reward or punishment. I'm not punishing anyone, Margaret said quietly. I'm making choices based on what I believe is best for everyone involved, including Emma. Sandra left shortly after, her parting words a mixture of disappointment and threat about how Emma would eventually resent having to work so hard when her grandmother could have made things easier. Margaret felt profound sadness rather than anger. Her daughter had become so focused on managing outcomes that she'd lost sight of the values that made outcomes meaningful. 2 months later, Margaret's wisdom was vindicated. Emma's first semester grades arrived with a handwritten thank you note that brought tears to Margaret's eyes. Dear Grandma Margaret, I just finished my first semester at State 3, 7 GPA, Dean's List, and I made great friends through my work-study job. You were right about working making me value my education more. When I'm spending my own money on textbooks, I pay attention in ways I probably wouldn't if everything was just given to me. Mom and Dad are still upset about the matching program, but I love it. I'm proud of what I'm accomplishing, and I know it's because you believed I could do it even when my parents thought it was too hard. The bookstore job has been amazing too. My manager says I'm one of her best workers, and she's already talking about promoting me to shift supervisor next semester. Thank you for everything, but especially for treating me like someone who's capable of taking care of herself. Love and gratitude, Emma. Margaret shared the letter with Eleanor over their morning coffee in the community garden they'd established together. That girl is going to be just fine, Eleanor commented. She's got your backbone and your common sense. I hope she never lets anyone convince her she's not capable of making her own decisions. As spring approached, Margaret reflected on her transformation with profound gratitude. She'd escaped family manipulation not through anger, but through the revolutionary act of living for herself. Her community garden flourished, her volunteer work at the literacy center provided deep satisfaction, and her relationship with James added joy rather than stress to her days. James's daughter visited from Seattle that spring, and the meeting went better than Margaret had dared hope. Sarah Patterson was everything Margaret had once hoped her own children would become. Warm, respectful, and genuinely interested in her father's happiness without calculating personal benefits. Dad talks about you constantly, Sarah confided over dinner. I haven't seen him this happy since before Mom died. Margaret realized she'd found something unexpected, a relationship based on mutual admiration and companionship, free from the complications of inheritance anxiety and family manipulation. Sandra hadn't spoken to Margaret in 3 months, their relationship frozen in disappointment over Margaret's refusal to manage her family's financial challenges. Robert maintained sporadic contact, but his messages grew shorter as he realized Margaret wasn't resuming her previous role as family financial resource. Margaret felt no sadness about these estrangements. She'd discovered that relationships based on control couldn't survive genuine independence, while relationships based on respect grew stronger over time. Emma's spring break visit to Asheville crystallized everything Margaret had accomplished. The pictures from their mountain hike showed a confident young woman and her grandmother, both muddy and laughing after helping plant the season's first vegetables. Emma had grown into exactly the kind of person Margaret had hoped: independent, responsible, and determined to use her success to help others. "I think I might want to work in nonprofit management after graduation," Emma said during her visit. "Seeing how your charitable giving works has made me realize how much impact you can have when you use resources strategically." Margaret smiled, understanding that her greatest legacy wouldn't be money, but values modeled and independence chosen. Emma would graduate not just with a degree, but with confidence that comes from earning success and wisdom to use it in service of something larger than herself. On a warm evening in late spring, Margaret sat on her apartment balcony with Eleanor, watching sunset paint the mountains in brilliant colors. "I was thinking about time," Margaret said. "How we spend it, what we value, what we choose to nurture." "Deep thoughts for a Wednesday evening," Eleanor teased gently. Margaret smiled. "I'm 73 years old, and I'm happier than I've been in decades. I have meaningful work, genuine friendships, and a romantic relationship that adds joy to my life. My granddaughter is thriving because I believed in her capabilities." "Sounds like a life well lived to me." "The strange thing is, I achieved all this by walking away from everything I thought defined me. My house, my family relationships, my role as the accommodating mother and grandmother." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes you have to lose who you were to discover who you're meant to be." As Margaret prepared for bed that night, she reflected on the year's transformation. She'd given Emma a role model for autonomous living, demonstrated that fulfillment was possible at any age, and shown that relationships must be based on mutual respect rather than one-sided accommodation. The phone rang with Emma's excited voice, sharing news about her summer internship at a nonprofit focused on educational access. Margaret smiled in the darkness, understanding that her greatest achievement wasn't the money she'd protected from manipulation, but the example she'd set of a woman who refused to be diminished by others' expectations and who created a meaningful life entirely on her own terms. It was exactly the inheritance she'd always hoped to provide. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.